Hello, weary traveller. Come, sit by my fire. The night is long, and the stars above hold many secrets. I am the lonely knight, and tonight I shall share with you an account about the lives of prostitutes in medieval Europe. Women who walked the margins of towns and cities, condemned by faith yet tolerated by law, surviving in the shadow of kings and priests. Close your eyes, if you will, and drift back with me to a time of honor, peril, and the song of steel at dawn. Tell me, wanderer, where do you listen from, and what hour finds you now? If my tale stirs something in you, then leave a like, and subscribe only if your heart says these stories are worth returning to. In the dim centuries after the fall of Rome, I wandered through villages where silence clung to the earth like mist. The empire's wide roads cracked beneath weeds, its cities shrunk to half-forgotten shells. Yet even as marble crumbled and markets grew sparse, the oldest of trades endured. Women, left without dowries or stripped of kin, turned to selling the only currency that could still be exchanged, their bodies. Where once Roman law had listed them in registers, now they lived in obscurity, unseen in parchment, yet present in every market lane. I recall the whispers of peasants in wooden huts, muttering prayers while averting their gaze from women who lingered at the edge of fairs. In the countryside, the priest's sermons rang against the timbered rafters of humble chapels, condemning lust as a gate to perdition. Still, in barns and shadowed stalls, arrangements were struck. Barter was as common as coin, a measure of grain, a cloth patched one winter too long, a handful of eggs. It was survival wrapped in shame, tolerated in silence though condemned aloud. The order Rome had left was scattered like broken shields. Its once regulated brothels, taxed and catalogued, no longer stood as institutions. Instead, intimacy exchanged for need became a matter of whispers, hidden in alleys, carried out in low cottages beyond the watchful eyes of bishops. These encounters rarely left marks in written records, yet the lives of those women bore the imprint of hunger and exclusion. A trade unrecorded is not a trade forgotten, for memory lingers in the cracks of stone. Markets still pulsed with life, even in lean times. Traveling merchants crossed muddy paths, bearing salt, iron, and tales of distant lands. Soldiers, scarred from petty wars of dukes and counts, sought comfort for their wounds, both of flesh and spirit. And where such men gathered, the figure of the prostitute followed close behind. She did not vanish with the fall of an empire. She adapted to the smaller scale of existence, to the rhythms of villages and fairs rather than vast imperial forums. In the north, the remnants of Germanic codes spoke little of such women, yet their presence could not be denied. Among the Franks, fines existed for fornication, though rarely enforced with consistency. I remember parchments from local courts where women were charged coins for indecency, though the men who sought them walked away unmarked. Justice, as always, weighed differently upon the shoulders of the powerless. It was here that the shadow of inequality grew long and unyielding. Faith crept into every corner of life, yet survival pressed harder. Widows with no inheritance, daughters without dowries, and slaves freed yet rootless often fell into this cycle. Their lives spoke of resilience, though cloaked in sorrow. They were neither celebrated nor truly erased. Rather, they hovered in a liminal state between necessity and condemnation. I cannot count how many faces I saw turned away from them in daylight, only to seek their company by night. The body, so often called sacred by the clergy, became a vessel of exchange in the silence of barns and the corners of taverns. These women carried burdens heavier than any sack of grain, for they bore the scorn of their neighbours while sustaining their own fragile existence. And yet, amid harsh winters and the cruelty of scarcity, their endurance testifies to an unspoken truth. Survival has many names, and not all are honoured. Looking back across that first age after Rome's decline, I see not scandal, but inevitability. Rural Europe could not erase desire, nor could it banish desperation. In every hamlet, between the fields and the churchyard, such women persisted like the wildflowers breaking through stone. Their lives remind me that history is not written only by kings and bishops, but also by those who carried shame so others might carry on. From the moment the cross became the compass of Europe, the voice of the Church reached into every corner of life. I remember the echo of Augustine's words, carried across centuries. Better the existence of prostitutes than the spread of greater evils. To him, and to many after him, their trade was a foul but necessary vent, a shadow tolerated to keep darker storms at bay. Such reasoning did not lessen the weight of sin upon these women. It only shifted the ground beneath their feet. The sermons rang loud in stone cathedrals and small parish churches alike. Priests condemned fornication with fiery breath, painting images of damnation vivid enough to chill the marrow. Yet, when the incense cleared and the candles dimmed, men still sought the company of women, who were condemned in words but permitted in practice. The contradiction was woven into the fabric of Christendom. Sin denounced, but sin allowed to persist in silence. I recall how Thomas Aquinas later placed his hand upon the matter, declaring prostitution to be like sewage in the city, unpleasant but necessary, lest worse filth spread. The analogy cut like a blade, women reduced to a necessary corruption for the supposed preservation of virtue. To live under such judgment was to carry not only poverty, but also the heavy cloak of eternal guilt, worn as visibly as the garments the law forced upon them. In every village, whispers followed these women like shadows. Neighbours crossed themselves when passing, as though warding off contagion of the soul. Yet, I saw with my own weary eyes the same men who scorned them by day knocking softly at their doors by night. Hypocrisy was not rare in that age. It was the air itself, breathed by those who condemned while consuming the very thing they cursed. The Church taught that salvation could only be won through penance. For prostitutes, this meant confession drenched in shame, acts of contrition that sometimes stretched across years. Some women abandoned the trade, entering Magdalene houses where strict discipline and silence replaced their former lives. Yet, not all could afford to repent, for poverty does not vanish when prayers are spoken. Hunger often pulled them back, even after vows to turn away. To see their faces at the altar was to witness courage. I remember women kneeling, heads bowed low, while priests reminded the congregation of their sins aloud. Such public humiliation was believed to heal, but it deepened scars unseen. And still, they rose from their knees, walking back into streets where survival demanded the very act they had been taught to despise. Faith and survival collided like hammer and anvil, and the woman's body bore the blow. Monks, bishops, and even popes thundered against vice, yet many fell themselves into weakness. Records survive of clerics fined or punished for frequenting brothels, proof that holiness and flesh often warred within the same soul. To live in those centuries was to witness a constant tension. Divine law pressing down from heaven, human desire pulling upward from earth, and women crushed between the two. As I sit by my fire tonight, I reflect on how morality in that age was as much about control as salvation. Prostitution was branded as sin, yet its endurance was not halted. Instead, it became a mirror of Christian Europe itself, proclaiming holiness, yet tolerating compromise. Those women carried the burden of contradiction, their existence both reviled and sustained by the very society that prayed for purity. When Charlemagne's banners flew across the heart of Europe, his reforms touched every part of life. Yet even he could not erase the presence of women who sold their bodies. The Carolingian world prized Christian order, striving to bind its people under the same faith and rule. Still, in the records of courts and councils, fines for sexual misconduct appeared like recurring stains. Prostitutes were named not to protect them, but to mark them as blemishes against the ideal of a righteous kingdom. Royal decrees aimed to bring discipline, but the reach of power was uneven. In the small villages where I passed, Peasants lived under the eye of local counts or abbots, and enforcement was at best inconsistent. Women caught in the act were sometimes fined with coin or goods, yet many returned to their trade by necessity. No ruler, no matter how mighty, could legislate away poverty. Hunger proved stronger than parchment, and survival ignored the ink of decrees. I remember entering Aachen, the seat of Charlemagne, where order and grandeur seemed unshakable. Yet even there, taverns and narrow alleys carried whispers of women who served men outside the bounds of law. They existed not as anomalies, but as part of the urban fabric. The more the empire sought unity, the more visible the cracks became, for human desire refused to bend entirely beneath the weight of discipline. The clergy spoke often of sin, and synods attempted to root out vice, but the struggle was endless. Bishops thundered against fornication, yet their words rarely reached the ears of men returning from battlefields or long trade journeys. The contrast was stark. Lofty visions of Christian purity above, while below, in streets of dirt and straw, old habits endured. I walked among both worlds and knew the distance between them was vast. Punishments carried little consistency. In some places, prostitutes were ordered to stand before the public in shame. In others, they were required to pay fees that filled the coffers of lords. Such treatment showed the ambivalence of society. If the sin could not be destroyed, it could at least be turned into revenue. What was condemned in sermons became, in practice, a tolerated part of governance, though never given dignity. The role of women in Carolingian times was tethered tightly to male authority. Fathers, husbands, and lords were expected to protect or control them, and those outside this structure were left adrift. Widows and abandoned wives often fell most easily into prostitution, their names appearing in court records alongside petty crimes. Their presence reminds me that morality was not only a matter of virtue, but of who had the shield of protection and who stood alone. I cannot forget the contradiction. Rulers sought to fashion a holy empire, yet within its very boundaries, the marginalized carried on in ways that betrayed that vision. Charlemagne's dream was one of order, unity, and Christian faith, but he reigned over human beings, not saints. His laws pressed hard, but the lives of the poor pressed harder still. In this tension, prostitution persisted, unwelcome but enduring. As the Carolingian Empire fractured after his death, these women remained in the margins, overlooked by chroniclers, yet present in daily life. Their existence shows us that even in times of great kings and vast ambitions, the humblest acts of survival shaped the true rhythm of the age. It is a memory carved not in monuments, but in the fragile endurance of those who had little but their own flesh to offer. The centuries turned, and with them came the rebirth of towns. Where once fields and forests held sway, stone walls rose and markets thrived, bringing with them the bustle of commerce and the weight of humanity. In these growing centers, prostitution no longer lingered solely in shadows, but began to take on more organized forms. Inns and bathhouses, crowded with merchants and travelers, became places where the body was as much for hire as food or lodging. The city's heart beat with trade, and within its rhythm, these women carved their place. Paris, London, and Cologne come to my memory most vividly. The narrow streets, filled with the smell of bread and tallow, also carried the murmur of promises exchanged for coin. Civic authorities, pragmatic in their governance, often tolerated the presence of brothels. Their reasoning was plain: better to have vice contained within certain walls than spread unchecked through the streets. And so, brothels appeared, sometimes under official sanction, hidden behind the veil of commerce, but well known to all. I saw how taxation crept into the arrangement. City officials, ever watchful for revenue, found ways to profit from what they preached against. Registers listed houses where such women worked, and coins flowed into civic coffers. In this strange balance, morality bent under the weight of practicality. The same councils that funded churches and cathedrals also accepted earnings from brothels, proving that survival of the town often outweighed purity of the soul. The architecture of these places lingered in my mind. Some were plain rooms above taverns, their floors worn by countless feet. Others, particularly in the wealthier quarters, mimicked the grandeur of respectable houses, with painted shutters and decorated doors. Yet behind every facade, the reality was the same. Women whose labor was scorned in public, but consumed in private. The walls kept secrets, but the streets always knew. Growth of cities also meant growth of temptation. Pilgrims on their way to holy shrines found detours into brothels before kneeling at altars. Soldiers returning from campaigns filled the taverns, their wages quickly exchanged for warmth of drink and of flesh. The urban revival created wealth, but it also multiplied human desire. Where men gathered in numbers, prostitution was never far behind, as constant as the tolling of church bells. Yet danger walked hand in hand with tolerance. In many cities, disputes flared between civic law and ecclesiastical decree. Bishops threatened excommunication for those who visited brothels, while city councils insisted on regulation rather than eradication. The conflict revealed how divided medieval society could be, caught between the ideals of heaven and the necessities of earth. The women themselves bore the brunt of this tension, punished by both sides, yet needed by both. I remember Cologne, where certain districts were whispered about openly, as though part of the map though never drawn. Officials guided the trade into designated areas, keeping it away from the cathedral, but close enough for revenue to flow. The lines of geography told the story of compromise, a city that could not rid itself of vice, only manage where it walked. Brothels became landmarks, as familiar as markets or mills, unspoken, yet undeniable. As towns grew brighter with commerce, the shadows grew deeper too. Brothels stood as testament to this paradox, tolerated for the sake of order, taxed for the sake of profit, yet forever marked with dishonor. To walk those streets was to witness a truth. The life of a city is not built only on stone and trade, but also on the hidden endurance of those who lived where morality and necessity collided. On market days, when the fields emptied into the town square, the air swelled with noise and color. Merchants called out their wares, the smell of spices mixed with livestock, and coins changed hands in a steady clatter. Within that commotion, prostitutes found their own place. They moved among the crowd as naturally as traders, offering a different sort of exchange. Their presence was not hidden, it was expected, as much a part of the marketplace as bread or cloth. The fairs drew men from faraway lands, carrying accents and manners strange to local ears, pilgrims with dust upon their cloaks, soldiers resting between campaigns, and craftsmen seeking opportunity all converged. For many, loneliness weighed as heavily as their packs, and the promise of company proved irresistible. Women who lived by selling their bodies often earned more on those days than in weeks of ordinary time. Festivals of trade became festivals of survival for them. Some towns began to confine such activity to specific quarters. Though the term red light district belongs to later centuries, the practice of assigning certain streets to prostitutes was well established. I recall the alleys of Paris, where lanterns marked the houses known for such trade. The rules were not born of kindness, but of control, an attempt to manage what could not be erased. These boundaries became invisible walls, keeping women both tolerated and contained. Negotiations often took place in taverns that spilled out into the streets. A mug of ale loosened tongues, and songs from minstrels masked the murmurs of agreements. In the glow of firelight, lines blurred between merriment and transaction. The body became another commodity, sold beside barrels of wine and baskets of fruit. The market was not only a place of goods, but of desires laid bare under the open sky. I remember seeing soldiers gather around these women, their laughter carrying over the crowd. Yet behind the noise, there was often a shadow of weariness in the eyes of the women. For them, every handshake and whispered bargain was not only an act of labor, but a risk, of violence, of disease, of shame that lingered after the day's profit was spent. The marketplace could bring abundance, but it also magnified danger. The church disapproved, yet its power was stretched thin on days when thousands gathered. Preachers raised their voices against sin, but few listened amid the bustle of trade. And so, these women walked openly, neither hidden nor celebrated, but simply absorbed into the tide of human need. Their existence reflected the paradox of medieval life, a society striving for holiness, yet grounded in appetite and survival. Court records from towns across Europe mention disputes born from these encounters. A woman might accuse a client of refusing payment, or a man might bring a case against her for theft. Such documents, though sparse, show how entwined prostitution was with daily commerce. They were reminders that even in the most ordinary acts of trade, the vulnerable had little recourse when wronged. Justice was measured not in fairness, but in power. As I think back on those market squares, I see more than noise and barter. I see how survival shaped every corner of medieval life. The women who stood there, offering themselves as part of the exchange, embodied both resilience and exclusion. They belonged everywhere and nowhere, bound to the rhythm of the fairs, but never granted the dignity of full belonging. Their story lingers, carried in the echoes of coins dropped upon wooden tables. In the growing towns of Europe, order was always fragile. Crowded streets, noisy taverns, and swelling markets demanded governance that reached beyond the sword. Civic councils soon learned that prostitution, though despised in sermons, could not be wished away. Instead of vain attempts to eradicate it, they chose to contain and profit from it. Regulations emerged, and with them, the strange spectacle of sin woven into the very fabric of municipal law. I walked through London's Southwark, where brothels lined the banks of the Thames under official sanction. The city turned vice into revenue, extracting taxes from the very houses it condemned. Similar arrangements appeared in Avignon, Cologne, and countless other towns. Prostitutes were instructed where to live, where to work, and even when to show themselves. Authority turned their existence into a managed enterprise, shaping it to fit within civic order. Some councils took a step further, establishing official brothels directly managed by the city itself. Records from Avignon describe municipal houses where women were supervised, their earnings feeding both their own survival and the coffers of the town. Such arrangements stripped away the illusion of moral purity. The very hands that lit candles in cathedrals also collected coin from the flesh of women. It was hypocrisy, but it was also governance. Regulations extended into details of daily life. In some towns, prostitutes were forbidden to work on holy days or near churches. Others forced them to appear in specific clothing, easily identified by passers-by. These rules did not protect them, they marked them. Officials wanted visibility, control, and separation, ensuring that these women remained both useful and set apart. Authority kept them at the edge of society, yet close enough to tax. Punishments for disobedience were harsh. If a woman worked outside the assigned district or without permission, she could face fines or public humiliation. Yet the men who bought their services rarely faced the same scrutiny. Municipal law reflected the imbalance of the age. Regulation without protection, profit without dignity. The burden fell squarely on those who had the least power to resist. Despite the stigma, these rules created a paradoxical form of recognition. Prostitutes became part of the official records, named in registers and bound by civic contracts. While their trade was deemed dishonorable, it was also indispensable enough to warrant attention from the highest authorities. Their existence forced towns to confront the tension between morality and necessity, and the law bent itself to accommodate both. I recall speaking with merchants who defended this system. They argued that controlled brothels preserved order, preventing assaults and keeping peace within the streets. To them, regulation was a lesser evil, a practical solution to an enduring problem. Yet, as I watched women herded into designated quarters, their freedom narrowed by decree, I wondered how much of that peace was purchased at their expense. The memory of those laws lingers like the toll of a bell. Municipal authorities did not abolish prostitution. They transformed it into something that served the city's needs. In their effort to maintain order, they ensured the trade endured, hidden in plain sight, always marked, always taxed. It was not compassion, nor cruelty, but calculation, and it left behind a legacy written in both ink and sorrow. In towns where trade flourished, guilds shaped nearly every aspect of life. Bakers, weavers, masons, and carpenters each held their place in the hierarchy, their banners and rules weaving order into the chaos of commerce. Yet one group of women, though part of the economic life of cities, stood apart. Prostitutes were excluded from the craft guilds, denied the dignity of belonging to the same structures that protected other workers. Still, traces of their own collective organization began to surface. Some records speak of women banding together under municipal oversight, forming associations that resembled guilds in all but name. They had rules for conduct, fees to pay, and even standards for dress. In certain towns, prostitutes were required to wear distinctive clothing, not just as stigma, but as a form of regulation. It was a strange mirror of the guild system, a professional framework imposed upon them, though never granting honor. I recall the laws of Augsburg, where prostitutes were instructed to wear striped garments, marking them as outside respectability. In Florence, yellow veils singled them out, ensuring no mistake about their trade. These rules, though humiliating, carried the weight of guild-like regulation. Just as a shoemaker was recognized by his apron, so too was a prostitute branded by cloth. Recognition came not as respect, but as control. The guilds themselves often opposed prostitutes, fearing moral corruption and disruption of family order. Yet the truth was simpler. Guilds guarded their privileges jealously, and these women represented labor outside their charter. Prostitutes were laborers without protection, contributing to the economy while bearing only its risks. They worked in an economy of survival, parallel to the ordered crafts, but never welcomed into their halls. In some cities, civic authorities imposed taxes upon prostitutes, as if they were a trade. These payments resembled guild dues, though without the benefits of solidarity or mutual aid. The women contributed to the wealth of the town, but received none of the protections enjoyed by members of official crafts. Their quasi-guild status was a reflection of how deeply prostitution had become woven into urban life, even as society sought to mark it as dishonorable. I saw how the language of regulation mimicked the guild system in cruel ways. Rules dictated the number of women allowed in certain houses, the hours they could work, and the penalties for stepping beyond their bounds. Like apprentices and masters, they were bound to codes not of their making. Yet, unlike guild members, their voices carried no weight in shaping those laws. They were subjects of governance, not participants in it. In the bustling centres of learning and trade, where guild banners decorated streets during festivals, prostitutes stood apart. Their labour was invisible in ceremonies, though indispensable in reality. They were not honoured in pageantry, nor remembered in guild records, but their presence shaped the city's rhythm just as surely as the tradesmen who carved stone or brewed ale. The silence around them was as deliberate as the laws that kept them marked. When I think back to those days, I see how the guild system both illuminated and obscured. It revealed the structure of labour in medieval towns, yet also highlighted who was left outside its walls. Prostitutes lived under rules as binding as any craft, but without the dignity of recognition. Their story reminds us that regulation can masquerade as belonging, while in truth it serves only to deepen exclusion. In the eyes of medieval authorities, clothing was more than fabric. It was a language of status and control. Sumptuary laws dictated who could wear silk, fur, or jeweled belts, binding society in visible hierarchies. For prostitutes, these rules cut deeper, branding them in colours and styles that marked dishonour. Florence decreed yellow veils, England forced striped hoods. Such garments were not mere symbols, but chains woven into cloth, ensuring shame walked with them in every step. I remember the streets of London, where these women were instantly recognized by their dress. The markings spared no dignity. Even a glance from a stranger carried judgment. Unlike the guild craftsman, proud of his apron or tools, the prostitute bore a uniform that stripped her of respect. She could not pass unnoticed in the crowd, for her veil or stripe declared her place in society. The law clothed her body, but it exposed her soul. The paradox was sharp. Officials mandated these garments to protect respectable women from being mistaken, yet it also ensured prostitutes could not escape their role. Even if one sought a new life, the branded attire forced recognition, pinning them forever to the margins. The veil or hood became a second skin, as binding as any shackle, denying anonymity or redemption in the eyes of neighbours. Sumptuary laws reached across Europe. In Aragon, prostitutes were ordered to wear distinctive cloaks. In parts of Germany, they bore coloured ribbons. The details varied, but the message never changed. You are a part, and you will be seen as such. This visibility was not protection, but exposure, leaving them vulnerable to insult, harassment, and violence. To walk the streets under such laws was to walk unshielded. I often wondered about the cruelty of those rules. They turned human beings into symbols, reducing complex lives to a single garment. Respectable society claimed to fear corruption, yet it placed all blame upon women, as though fabric itself could carry morality. Men moved freely in their tunics and cloaks, unmarked, even when they sought these women's company. The cloth bore only one story, and it was written upon the bodies of the powerless. There were those who resisted. Some women discarded the mandated attire, hoping to blend among townsfolk, only to face harsher punishment when discovered. Others tried to alter their garments subtly, hiding the signs under cloaks or adornments. These small acts of defiance reveal the yearning for dignity, the desperate desire to walk through a marketplace or church without the brand of shame. The contradiction of tolerance and rejection lived in every stitch of those clothes. Society relied on prostitutes as a constant presence, yet punished them by making their dishonor public. The veil or hood became a signal to clients and an invitation to ridicule, all in one. Their very appearance reminded the town of its double standards, condemning what it consumed, marking what it tolerated. When I recall the sight of those marked garments, I think less of fabric and more of weight. They were not just clothes, they were burdens, visible proof of exclusion. The law used cloth to speak, and it spoke with cruelty. These women walked not only with their own struggles, but with the constant reminder that the world had chosen to clothe them in dishonor. That memory lingers like a shadow stitched into history. Across the candlelit halls where words were copied by monks and sung by poets, the figure of the prostitute often appeared. She was rarely shown with compassion, more often cast as a symbol of weakness or sin. Yet sometimes, between the lines, one can hear the echo of resilience. Writers did not invent these women. They observed them in the same streets we all walked. Their voices entered literature not as dignified characters, but as mirrors of the anxieties and contradictions of society. The French fabliaux, bawdy tales recited with laughter in taverns, often depicted prostitutes with sharp wit. They tricked greedy priests, mocked foolish husbands, and exposed hypocrisy through humour. Though cruel in their jest, these stories revealed a truth. Prostitutes were seen not only as objects of desire, but as figures capable of turning the tables. The laughter they provoked carried both ridicule and reluctant respect, a reflection of the tension they embodied. I recall Chaucer's tales, where the wife of Bath, though not a prostitute, bore qualities often associated with such women: independence, sexual frankness, and boldness in a world that demanded silence from wives. His writing showed how easily the line blurred between the respectable woman who claimed her own desire and the stigmatized woman who sold it. Literature revealed what law tried to deny: that women's voices could not be silenced completely. Preachers also wrote, but their words were sharpened into warnings. Sermons compared prostitutes to snares set by the devil, leading men from virtue to ruin. These fiery images filled manuscripts with dread, echoing across pulpits where congregations trembled. Yet the vehemence betrayed an uneasy truth. The church's fury was fueled by how deeply rooted prostitution had become. If it had not been common, it would not have been so feared. Poetry, too, carried these women into memory. Troubadours in the south of France sang of love in lofty terms, yet also included verses mocking the mercenary nature of passions sold for coin. Their lines reflected the duality of their society, exalting love as a sacred bond while acknowledging its transaction in taverns and alleys. The prostitute became both the shadow and the foil of the courtly lady, a reminder that ideals rested upon a world far more complex. Even in chronicles, where kings and battles filled the pages, prostitutes occasionally appeared. Not as heroines, but as reminders of disorder, accused of spreading sin in camps or corrupting young men. These mentions, though brief, show that their presence was too visible to be erased completely. The chronicler's silence was not ignorance. It was deliberate, for their existence clashed with the noble image of Christian kingdoms. Yet the truth slipped through, inked in margins and accusations. I saw how words shaped perception more fiercely than any garment. To be written as sinful, witty, or corrupt was to be remembered as such for centuries. Literature did not grant prostitutes dignity, but it preserved their shadow in the memory of Europe. Even when distorted, their image lived on, etched into parchment and carried by the voices of poets and preachers. When I read those old texts by flickering firelight, I feel both sorrow and recognition. The words reveal not only what society thought of these women, but also what it feared within itself: desire, hypocrisy, and the frailty of virtue. In their portrayal, I see less of the women themselves and more of the struggle of an age to reconcile flesh with faith. Their image in literature was a mirror that the Middle Ages could not look away from. The Church, though stern in its condemnations, never abandoned the language of salvation. For prostitutes, the path to redemption was narrow, but not entirely closed. Preachers reminded them of Mary Magdalene, portrayed as the great penitent who turned from sin to sanctity. Her story became both a burden and a promise, used to shame women for their trade, yet also to hold out a fragile hope of renewal. It was a narrative that pressed upon their lives like an iron weight. I remember the Magdalene houses, places where women who left prostitution were gathered. These institutions, often under the guidance of religious orders, sought to reform through prayer, silence, and labor. Their daily lives were stripped of color. Long hours of devotion, menial tasks, and obedience to strict discipline. For some, it was a sanctuary from violence and poverty. For others, a prison of a different kind. Redemption was offered, but it came at the cost of freedom. Monastic chronicles speak of women who entered convents after abandoning their trade. The Church praised such transformations as triumphs of grace, holding them up as living sermons. Yet not all were embraced equally. Wealthier prostitutes who brought donations were received more readily, while the poor, with nothing but repentance to offer, often found doors closed. Even in redemption, inequality shadowed them, reminding us how salvation was shaped by worldly means. Public rituals of penance carried their own weight. I recall accounts of women standing barefoot in church, clad in sackcloth, while priests declared their sins before the gathered faithful. Such humiliation was meant to cleanse the soul, but it left scars deeper than the flesh. To be forgiven required not only sorrow, but also exposure, the kind that bound shame to memory long after absolution was given. Still, some women embraced this path willingly. I saw in their eyes the longing for peace, the desire to be freed from the double life of condemnation and survival. For them, the cloister offered safety that the streets never could. They exchanged the noise of taverns for the chant of psalms, the coin of clients for the bread of communal tables. Their lives, though restricted, bore a stillness absent from the world outside the convent walls. Yet the balance was never simple. Many who sought redemption were drawn back by hunger, by children to feed, by the absence of any trade to sustain them. Confession became a cycle: sin, repentance, absolution, and return. The church saw weakness. I saw the iron grip of poverty, which no prayer alone could loosen. Forgiveness might touch the soul, but it did not fill the stomach nor clothe the body. Mary Magdalene's name was invoked endlessly, yet her story was less about the woman herself and more about society's need for a symbol. She was a vessel for the tension between sin and sanctity, used to remind all women of their supposed fragility and their dependence on the church. For prostitutes, she was both a guiding light and a constant reminder of the judgment they bore. The weight of that symbol never lifted. As I reflect, I see that penitence in the Middle Ages was less a matter of mercy than of control. The church sought to shepherd souls, but it also sought to bind women into a framework that offered little room for choice. Redemption was possible, but always on terms set by others. For the women who endured it, salvation was not only a matter of heaven, it was the cost of survival in a world that gave them few paths to walk. When the call to Jerusalem echoed across Christendom, men from every corner of Europe took up the cross. Armies swelled with knights, peasants, and wanderers, bound for lands they had never seen. Alongside them came those who served not with sword or shield, but with presence and flesh. Prostitutes followed the crusading hosts, as inevitable as campfires and banners. Their existence was not glorified in chronicles, yet it was undeniable, written between the lines of military life. In the sprawling camps near Constantinople, I saw how order often faltered. Soldiers, far from home and hardened by pilgrimage, sought release from loneliness and fear. Women who traveled with them provided not only sexual service, but also cooking, washing, and tending to the wounded. They became part of the machinery of survival, though their contribution was never praised. Their role was tolerated, whispered about, and condemned in sermons, yet essential to the rhythm of the march. Church leaders thundered against their presence. Bishops preached that armies carrying the cross should be pure, untainted by vice. Councils tried to expel prostitutes from camps, threatening punishment for soldiers who visited them. Yet these decrees often failed in practice. Commanders, needing to maintain discipline, saw regulation as more practical than eradication. Desire, like hunger, could not be banned by words alone. Crusading chronicles mention moments when prostitutes were driven out, only to return with the next wave of recruits. Their persistence revealed both the weakness of enforcement and the strength of necessity. Even kings recognized the futility of absolute bans. Richard the Lionheart himself issued orders during the Third Crusade to restrict, not abolish, the presence of women in camp. The effort was not to erase the trade, but to contain it within limits acceptable to authority. Life in those encampments was harsh. Disease spread easily, and women often bore the worst of its toll. They were blamed for corruption, yet they also provided care when sickness struck soldiers. I remember accounts of women who tended to dying crusaders, their presence shifting from vice to mercy in the shadow of death. Such acts were rarely recorded in honor, but they speak of the blurred lines that marked their lives. The clash of cultures in the East added another layer. In lands of Byzantium and the Levant, Western soldiers encountered different customs regarding sexuality. This mingling fueled anxieties, with clerics fearing contamination not only of the body, but of the soul. Prostitutes became symbols of both temptation and transgression, embodying the fear of moral decay in foreign lands. Their bodies carried the weight of Europe's judgments even as they endured the harshness of campaign life. In truth, the crusading armies depended upon them in ways unspoken. Soldiers who might otherwise have turned their frustration into violence against local populations often found an outlet in the camp followers. Pragmatic rulers understood this, tolerating prostitution as a means of maintaining fragile order. Behind the clash of swords and the cry of prayers, these women sustained an undercurrent of survival that rarely entered official histories. Looking back on the Crusades, I see not only the battles and sieges, but also the quiet endurance of those women who walked in the shadows of the banners. They bore scorn from priests, danger from soldiers, and hardship from the road, yet they remained part of the march. Their story lies hidden beneath the grandeur of conquest, a reminder that even holy wars were lived in the company of contradictions no decree could erase. Within the walls of medieval towns, bathhouses stood as places of cleansing and conversation. The steam rising from their chambers promised not only warmth, but a brief escape from the grime of daily life. Yet behind the scent of herbs and the sound of splashing water, another trade quietly flourished. Many bathhouses doubled as spaces of prostitution, their doors opening to both health and desire. To the weary traveller, the line between bathing and indulgence blurred easily. I recall the streets of Paris where bathhouses bore signs of legitimacy, tubs filled with hot water, attendants offering oils and towels, yet their reputation was clouded. Neighbours whispered of the goings-on inside, where men lingered too long in company not meant for cleansing alone. Authorities knew of it, and their response shifted with the times. At moments strict suppression, at others reluctant tolerance. The bathhouse became both a public service and a public scandal. The church's disapproval rang clear. Preachers warned that the mingling of naked bodies, even in the name of hygiene, invited temptation too strong to resist. Sermons thundered against these establishments, urging Christians to wash their souls rather than their flesh. Yet the popularity of the baths never waned. They remained crowded, for warmth and cleanliness were luxuries rare in the Middle Ages, and human weakness walked hand in hand with comfort. Civic councils wrestled with the problem. Shutting bathhouses risked unrest, for people valued them deeply, especially in the colder months. But allowing them unchecked meant turning a blind eye to sin. The compromise often lay in regulation, assigning hours, taxing the owners, and occasionally inspecting the premises. In many towns, bathhouses became semi-official spaces where indulgence was an open secret, tolerated so long as it was contained. Accounts from Nuremberg and Strasbourg describe raids upon bathhouses accused of immorality. Women were fined, owners punished, yet soon enough the doors reopened. The cycle repeated endlessly, for demand never faded. The tension between law and life was written into the very steam that filled those chambers. No proclamation could keep the bathhouse empty, nor could it cleanse the reputation that clung to its walls. Some establishments were more discreet, offering private rooms away from the common tubs. In these hidden spaces, prostitution flourished most openly. For the wealthy, such encounters carried an air of luxury, cloaked in the pretense of health. For the poor women who worked there, it was a means of survival, their labour inseparable from the steam and the water that masked their trade. The bathhouse became both a sanctuary and a snare. Illness added another layer to their story. Bathhouses were linked to outbreaks of disease, and suspicion often fell upon the women who worked within them. Leprosy, syphilis, and other ailments were feared as divine punishment, and prostitutes in bathhouses bore the brunt of that fear. They were accused not only of sin, but of spreading sickness, as though their very bodies carried corruption into the world. Stigma clung as persistently as steam to the skin. When I think of those places now, I see more than the warmth of water or the laughter of men in company. I see the contradictions of a society caught between its ideals and its appetites. Bathhouses stood at the heart of towns, open to all, yet forever shadowed by suspicion. They reveal how medieval Europe struggled to balance cleanliness with morality, indulgence with condemnation, and how women bore the heaviest cost of that struggle. Wherever universities rose, the streets around them gained a peculiar rhythm. In Paris, Oxford, and Bologna, the sound of debate in Latin echoed through cloisters by day, but at night, another commerce stirred in the alleys. Students, many of them young men far from home, carried not only books and pens, but also desires unchecked by family or custom. Authorities, fearing unrest, often allowed prostitutes to live near student quarters, believing it safer to channel lust than to let it wander uncontrolled. I walked once through the left bank of Paris, where taverns overflowed with raucous songs sung by scholars. Amid the clatter of tankards, women circulated, offering company in exchange for coin. The church disapproved, but city officials tolerated these encounters as a necessary concession. Better, they thought, to contain vice near the universities than to see respectable wives or daughters assaulted. It was a logic born of compromise, a pattern repeated across Europe. Oxford bore its own scars from such tensions. Records tell of violent clashes between students and townsfolk, many rooted in disputes over prostitutes. Scholars, emboldened by youth and ale, often quarrelled over payment or possession, leaving women caught in the middle. The brothels near the university were both tolerated and resented, seen as sources of disorder but also as indispensable outlets. The presence of prostitutes became inseparable from the identity of the university town itself. Bologna, too, carried this mark. Its brothels stood close enough to student lodgings that the line between study and indulgence blurred. Civic officials recognized the profit, taxing houses and enforcing regulations, while turning a blind eye to hypocrisy. Professors lectured on virtue inside lecture halls, while outside, students sought comfort in ways that mocked those very ideals. The contradiction was clear, yet it endured without resolution. The voices of women who worked in these towns rarely reached parchment, yet their existence is preserved in the records of fines and disputes. A prostitute accused a student of failing to pay. A scholar charged her with theft. These cases reveal not only the exploitation they endured, but also the fragile line of agency they tried to hold. Within the legal frameworks of towns, their words were often silenced, though traces remain as quiet testimony. Universities drew men from across Christendom, and with them came varied expectations. Some sought prostitutes as a rite of passage, others as relief from celibacy imposed by their clerical training. Civic leaders, eager to protect their towns from scandal, often chose regulation over prohibition. They claimed order was best served by allowing what could not be erased, and so prostitutes became part of the machinery of higher learning, though never acknowledged in its glory. I recall the words of a Parisian chronicler who lamented the wildness of students and the women who followed them. Yet his complaint was less about morality than about disruption. Prostitution was woven into the life of the university, tolerated as long as it did not spill into chaos. The students carried reputations of brilliance and recklessness alike, and prostitutes bore the blame when discipline faltered. Their presence was convenient scapegoat and necessary concession at once. As the lamps burned low in those ancient towns, the paradox remained. Centers of learning built to refine the mind were also places where desire was openly bought and sold. The pursuit of wisdom coexisted uneasily with the commerce of the body, both shaping the rhythm of life around the universities. These women, though never honored in lecture halls, became part of the unspoken story of Europe's intellectual awakening. As I journeyed across kingdoms, I learned that the law spoke with many tongues. What was permitted in one town could mean punishment in another, for prostitution's place was never fixed. In Venice, brothels were not only tolerated, but managed by the state, woven into the machinery of governance. Florence, too, established municipal houses, turning the trade into a civic enterprise. By contrast, Northern Europe leaned toward restriction, its laws shaped by sterner views of morality and order. England presented its own contradictions. In London, the Bishop of Winchester held authority over the Suffolk brothels, making clerical hands complicit in their existence. The houses paid fees, and the women within were called Winchester geese. Yet the church simultaneously thundered against fornication, branding these very women as sinful. Law in England reflected the same paradox seen elsewhere. Revenue embraced, while morality condemned. The hypocrisy was sharp enough to wound. In the cities of the German lands, regulation varied by degree. Nuremberg allowed prostitution within certain districts, while Cologne imposed fines upon women caught outside their assigned areas. Enforcement was strict at times, lax at others, always shifting with the needs of the council and the mood of the populace. To live under such laws was to walk upon shifting ground, never certain where the boundary lay. Scandinavia carried a different story. There, prostitution was less organized, often punished under broader categories of fornication or disorderly conduct. Women were fined or beaten, their trade acknowledged only in the language of sin. Unlike Italy or England, no official brothels existed under municipal rule, but that absence did not mean absence of the trade itself. Where men gathered, prostitution followed, even without formal recognition. In the Iberian kingdoms, royal authority often shaped the rules. Castile and Aragon established regulations that tied brothels directly to the crown, a way to exert control over cities while profiting from vice. Records speak of laws ensuring prostitutes lived in designated quarters, their trade framed as both tolerated and dishonorable. The monarchy sought to regulate morality while drawing coin from the very sin it condemned. France, divided into many jurisdictions, reflected the diversity of Europe itself. Paris allowed regulated houses under municipal supervision, while smaller towns imposed harsher restrictions. The crown intervened occasionally, but more often the local councils held sway. This patchwork of rules meant a prostitute's fate depended less on her trade and more on the place where she lived. Geography, more than morality, dictated her condition. The legal frameworks across Europe reveal the tension between necessity and virtue. Authorities recognized prostitution as inevitable, yet few dared to speak of it as labor. Laws were crafted to control, to profit, and to mark these women as apart from the rest of society. Whether taxed, confined, or punished, they were bound by rules that acknowledged their presence while denying their dignity. When I reflect upon these varied laws, I see less the hand of justice and more the hand of compromise. Each region bent to the pressures of survival, commerce, and faith, shaping its own balance between condemnation and tolerance. Prostitution endured not because it was loved, but because it could not be eradicated. The law did not erase these women. It trapped them in a net of shifting rules, woven differently in each land, but heavy all the same. Among the many paths women could walk in the Middle Ages, few offered stability. Domestic service, weaving, or field labor provided meager wages, often insufficient to feed even one mouth. For widows left without inheritance, for daughters whose dowries had been spent, and for wives abandoned by men who vanished into war or pilgrimage, choices narrowed cruelly. Prostitution became not an indulgence, but a strategy of survival, a way to stave off hunger when no other work remained open. I have passed through towns where young women stood outside taverns, their eyes weary yet determined. They were not lured by vice, as priests so often claimed, but driven by necessity. A few coins earned in a single night could equal days of labor in a workshop. The work carried shame and risk, yet it also brought food to the table. To judge them without understanding the weight of poverty is to turn away from truth. The guild system barred them, and respectable households rarely welcomed them in service once their reputation was known. This exclusion left them bound to the margins. Even when they sought honest labor, suspicion followed like a shadow. Prostitution thus became a trap, entered by desperation, maintained by stigma, and rarely escaped. The economy itself seemed to push them toward it, then condemned them once they yielded. Many were mothers, their earnings spent not on themselves, but on children who needed bread. Court records tell of women testifying that they had no other means to provide. Their words often fell on deaf ears, for judges valued order more than compassion. Yet behind every coin exchanged in a brothel lay the cry of a child or the emptiness of a cupboard. It was survival disguised as sin. I remember a widow in Avignon whose husband died in battle, leaving her with nothing. Denied aid from her kin and refused entry into a convent, she turned to prostitution in the town's regulated quarter. Her life was recorded in fines and permits, not in honor or song. She was one among many whose faces history chose to forget, though their endurance carried generations forward. Economic vulnerability was not limited to the poor alone. Even women of middling families, when stripped of protection, could fall into this path. Dowries lost in misfortune or debt, promises of marriage broken, and the constant uncertainty of medieval life left many precarious. What seems like scandal to us was, for them, often the last thread between survival and starvation. The imbalance of opportunity between men and women deepened this burden. A man without land might still find work as a laborer, soldier, or apprentice. A woman without resources had far fewer doors to knock upon. Prostitution, though condemned, remained one of the few that opened. It is easy to condemn from the safety of parchment, but harder to dismiss when you have seen the desperation in a woman's eyes. When I look back on those centuries, I do not see only scandal. I see resilience. These women bore shame imposed upon them, yet they endured when society offered no refuge. Their existence reveals the cruelty of a world where survival demanded sacrifice, and where dignity was denied even to those who fought hardest to live. They were not merely sinners, but survivors carved from the harsh stone of necessity. Though far less spoken of, men too sold their bodies in the shadows of medieval Europe. Records are scarce, for chroniclers preferred silence over acknowledgement, but traces remain in court documents and condemnations. Male prostitution was tied not only to commerce, but also to the deep fear of sodomy, which the Church denounced with particular severity. Women who sold their bodies were condemned as weak. Men who did so were judged as abominations, punished with harsher penalties. I recall reading accounts from Italian courts, where men were accused of offering themselves to other men in exchange for coin. The words of the records trembled with outrage, calling for exile or even death. Unlike the regulated brothels where women were tolerated, male prostitution existed outside the pale of law. It was cloaked in secrecy, for exposure meant not fines, but ruin. Desire, when expressed between men, bore the heaviest of stigmas. In some noble courts, whispers spoke of young male servants, often poor and desperate, who provided sexual favors to their lords. Chronicles avoid the details, but hints remain in letters and accusations. These arrangements revealed both the vulnerability of the powerless and the hypocrisy of those in authority. The same bishops who condemned sodomy thunderously often turned blind eyes when the powerful were implicated. Justice, once again, was uneven in its reach. The connection between male prostitution and accusations of sodomy was constant. Whereas women were framed as necessary evils, men in this trade were labeled corrupters of society. Punishments included public flogging, imprisonment, or even burning, reflecting the terror with which medieval Christendom regarded such acts. These harsh measures did not erase the practice, but they ensured it lived in silence, whispered rather than spoken. Some documents suggest male prostitution was more common in urban centers with transient populations. Sailors, students, and soldiers, men cut loose from the bonds of family, sometimes sought the company of other men. In such places, clandestine exchanges occurred, though at great risk. The invisibility of this trade reveals less its absence than the fear of its exposure. The walls of towns kept many secrets, and this was one of them. The Church's wrath was particularly fierce. Preachers claimed such relations offended both divine law and natural order. While female prostitution was tolerated as a lesser sin, male prostitution was condemned as rebellion against creation itself. This stark difference shows how morality was less about the act of selling flesh than about the anxieties surrounding gender and power. The stigma weighed doubly upon those men, crushing them under silence. Yet even in condemnation, fragments of humanity appear. Some testimonies reveal young men pleading for mercy, explaining their desperation and hunger. Their voices echo the same refrain as the women's. Poverty drove them. Exclusion left them no choice. The law heard only sin, not survival. Their words, preserved in fragile ink, speak across centuries of lives endured at the edge of acceptance, marked by fear as much as by shame. As I reflect on this hidden history, I see how male prostitution exposes the strict boundaries of medieval morality. Women were despised but managed. Men were despised and destroyed. Their existence reminds us that judgment was shaped not only by faith, but also by fear, and that survival sometimes walked paths society refused to name. To remember them is to acknowledge the silence that history tried so hard to keep. Fear of illness haunted every corner of medieval life. Towns with narrow streets and poor sanitation became breeding grounds for disease, and suspicion often turned toward prostitutes. Long before the great outbreak of syphilis in the late 15th century, concerns lingered about leprosy, fevers, and vague venereal afflictions. Prostitutes were accused of spreading these ailments, though medicine of the time could scarcely explain their causes. The stigma of sickness clung to them, deepening the weight of moral condemnation already borne. In some places, civic councils sought to limit risk by banning prostitutes during outbreaks. Records from German towns describe expulsions when leprosy was feared, forcing women to leave the city walls until danger passed. Yet such measures punished survival more than they prevented disease. The same men who ordered their removal often welcomed them back when the panic subsided, revealing the hypocrisy of laws that shifted with circumstance. Medical thought, shaped by Galen and filtered through Christian teaching, spoke of balance in humours. Prostitutes, by engaging with many men, were said to spread corruption of seed, a notion as mystical as it was moralizing. Physicians sometimes recommended avoidance, yet others prescribed visits to prostitutes as a way for men to release excess humours. Such contradictions left women trapped between superstition and necessity, blamed regardless of outcome. I remember the bathhouses, where fears of contagion and accusations against prostitutes intertwined. Steam was thought to open pores and invite disease, while physical contact heightened suspicion. When illness spread, women who worked in such places were often scapegoated. Few asked whether poverty or lack of sanitation played a greater role. It was simpler to lay blame upon bodies already marked as sinful. With the arrival of syphilis near the close of the Middle Ages, fear reached new heights. The disease swept across Europe with devastating speed, disfiguring faces and striking terror into communities. Prostitutes were accused of carrying the sickness more than any other group, their bodies cast as vessels of divine punishment. In truth, the disease touched every level of society, from peasants to kings, but the poor bore the harsher stigma. Some authorities sought remedies through regulation. Brothels were inspected more strictly, and women suspected of illness were expelled. A few towns attempted crude medical examinations, though knowledge of contagion remained limited. Instead of offering care, the measures pushed women further into vulnerability, forcing them into secrecy or exile. Public health became less about healing and more about policing. The burden of these accusations left scars beyond the flesh. To be branded as diseased meant exclusion from markets, taverns, and even churches. Women could find themselves cast out with no recourse, their poverty deepened by the very fear they did not cause. Illness magnified the stigma of prostitution, intertwining sin with sickness in a knot society refused to untangle. Looking back, I see how fear guided law more than reason. Prostitutes were not the root of disease, but they bore its blame, made symbols of corruption whenever illness spread. Their story reveals how medieval Europe fought unseen enemies with superstition, often at the expense of its most vulnerable. The memory is sobering. Even in sickness, society chose to condemn before it chose to understand. When the great pestilence swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, no soul was untouched. Whole villages fell silent, cities emptied, and the air itself seemed heavy with dread. Prostitutes, like all others, faced the terror of sudden death. Many turned from their trade, not out of repentance, but because survival demanded new paths. Some cared for the sick, nursing strangers when even kin had fled. In that grim season, their work shifted from pleasure to mercy, though it earned them little recognition. I remember hearing of women in Florence who, deprived of clients, offered themselves as attendants to plague-stricken households. They risked their lives for a few coins or for shelter, handling the bodies no one else would touch. Yet gratitude was scarce. Instead, suspicion grew. Many accused them of carrying the disease, their presence linked with decay and contagion. In death's shadow, stigma hardened rather than softened. The plague reshaped economies, and with them, the conditions of prostitution. Populations shrank, labor grew scarce, and wages for many workers rose. Yet prostitutes did not benefit in equal measure. Their clients had died in droves, and survivors often shunned them out of fear. Women who had once depended on crowded marketplaces now stood idle in deserted streets, their livelihood destroyed as swiftly as families were swept away. Religious fervor intensified. Some preachers declared the plague God's punishment for sin, and prostitutes became living symbols of the vice they denounced. They were named as causes of divine wrath. Held responsible for calamity they had no power to summon. This scapegoating gave the fearful a target for their rage, adding persecution to the burden of hunger and grief. Their bodies, already branded by shame, were now branded by calamity. Yet not all condemned. A few chroniclers, rare voices in the storm, noted the courage of women who did not flee when others abandoned the dying. They wrote of prostitutes who washed the sick, carried water, and closed the eyes of the dead. These acts, though uncelebrated, reveal the human truth. Even those shamed by society bore compassion in their hearts. In plague's darkest night, they carried a light few acknowledged. Communities attempted to restore order through stricter laws. In some towns, prostitutes were expelled entirely, accused of spreading the pestilence. In others, their quarters were sealed, trapping them in confinement as if isolation could halt death's march. None of it proved effective, for the plague paid no heed to rules. Still, the effort to control them shows how society sought to impose blame rather than accept helplessness. The devastation altered social bonds. Many women who survived found new paths afterward, entering service or remarrying as populations sought to rebuild. Yet for others, prostitution remained their only option, now more precarious than before. With fewer clients, competition sharpened and danger grew. The plague had thinned numbers, but it had not erased desire, nor the structures that confined women to its trade. When I look back upon those years, I see how the Black Death magnified every contradiction. Prostitutes were both feared and needed, condemned and relied upon, blamed and forgotten. Their fate during the plague reflects the fate of Europe itself, caught between faith and despair, survival and judgment. The fire of pestilence did not spare them. It burned their lives into sharper relief, leaving their endurance etched into the memory of calamity. The voices of priests and monks filled every corner of medieval life, shaping how people thought of sin and salvation. From pulpits, they railed against fornication, naming prostitutes as instruments of the devil. Their words painted these women as destroyers of men's souls, their very presence a threat to Christian order. Yet as I moved from town to town, I learned how often those who condemned with their tongues faltered with their deeds. The clergy, bound to vows of chastity, were not immune to the same temptations they denounced. Court records reveal this hypocrisy with painful clarity. Priests caught in brothels were fined or suspended, sometimes stripped of their office. Monks were accused of slipping away from cloisters to meet women in taverns or designated quarters. The gap between preaching and practice was wide, and the women bore the heavier weight of punishment. Their clients, though cloaked in sacred vows, often walked away with reputations scarred but intact, the double standard cut like a blade across centuries. I recall the satire of the time, for even common folk mocked the failings of priests. Tales and plays circulated, describing lecherous clerics sneaking into brothels under cover of night. These works exposed what people already knew, that the clergy were human and as weak to desire as any soldier or merchant. Yet instead of lessening condemnation, such stories deepened the burden on women who were blamed for tempting even the most holy. Theologians wrestled with the contradiction. Augustine had declared that prostitution prevented greater evils, yet clerical authorities also warned that contact with prostitutes endangered the priesthood itself. This created a cycle of denunciation, tolerance, and shame, each voice pulling in a different direction. The clergy became both moral guardians and clandestine participants, caught in a web of their own making. The women stood at the center, never free of judgment. Sermons grew increasingly fiery in times of crisis. During famines, wars, or plagues, preachers pointed to prostitutes as living evidence of God's anger. They were accused of drawing punishment upon the land, of being the visible face of hidden sin. Such accusations did not rest on evidence, but on fear. To blame them was easier than confronting the failings of kings, lords, or even the church itself. Scapegoats are ever easier to find than true causes. Yet in some moments, compassion surfaced. Certain confessors offered prostitutes the chance of absolution if they left their trade and embraced penitence. A few convents opened their doors, though often only to those with some means to contribute. Charity and harshness intertwined, leaving women uncertain of what reception awaited them. A priest could be savior one day, accuser the next. The inconsistency was as cruel as the condemnation itself. I saw how these attitudes shaped daily life. A prostitute in London or Avignon not only faced the scorn of neighbours, but also the constant threat of denunciation from the pulpit. To hear her life called wicked before an entire parish was to live under public humiliation week after week. Even so, many continued, for hunger and need were stronger than words. The sermons thundered, but necessity spoke louder. When I reflect upon the clergy's stance, I see a mirror of medieval society itself, torn between faith and frailty, holiness and hypocrisy. Priests and monks spoke with authority, yet they stumbled like all men. Prostitutes bore the consequences, treated as symbols of corruption while their clients hid behind robes of sanctity. It was a burden of injustice, carved deep into the memory of the age, and one that reveals more about the weakness of men than the sin of women. Wherever the sea carried men across uncertain waters, port towns became havens of both commerce and desire. Genoa, Venice, and Hamburg rang with the clamour of sailors returning from voyages long and perilous. They brought silks, spices, and coins from distant lands. But they also carried hunger for drink, laughter, and the company of women. Prostitutes flourished in these places, their lives bound to the ebb and flow of ships docking at the harbours. The port was not only a gate of trade, but also of flesh. Venice, with its canals glittering in the sun, tolerated brothels with unusual openness. The Republic taxed them, regulated their quarters, and ensured their presence was woven into the life of the city. Women worked near the Rialto, where merchants gathered to strike bargains, and their trade became as predictable as the tides. In this city of wealth and excess, prostitution was treated less as a moral failing and more as a civic necessity. Genoa's narrow streets told a harsher story. Sailors, freed from discipline after long months at sea, crowded into taverns where prostitutes waited. Violence was frequent, disputes often settled with fists or blades. Yet the city tolerated the trade, for it eased tensions and filled municipal coffers. In these maritime hubs, control mattered more than purity. Authority accepted what it could not abolish, crafting laws to keep vice in its place. Hamburg, standing watch over the northern seas, bore a similar pattern. Brothels clustered near the docks, where men poured out after voyages to the Baltic or beyond. Women in these quarters lived lives shaped by transience, clients who came with the tide and vanished with the morning sail. Their work was precarious, their safety uncertain, but the demand never faltered. Port life was restless, and so too was the fate of those bound to it. Authorities in these cities often profited directly. Taxes on brothels supported civic projects, sometimes even paying for repairs to docks or walls. This uneasy bond between vice and governance revealed the pragmatism of port towns. Officials might denounce prostitution in principle, but in practice, they depended on it. The sea brought riches, and prostitution ensured those riches flowed into every corner of the city, including the treasury. Yet the dangers of disease weighed heavily in ports. With men arriving from distant lands, illness traveled swiftly, and prostitutes were blamed as its carriers. Suspicion shadowed their steps, as though their bodies alone brought contagion across oceans. In truth, sickness came with ships, with cargo, with the very movement that made the ports thrive. Still, it was the women who bore the brunt of accusation, punished for forces beyond their control. Cultural mixing shaped these spaces. In Venice and Genoa, sailors from the East mingled with Europeans, bringing not only goods, but also new customs. Prostitutes moved within this swirl, serving men of many tongues, their work reflecting the global reach of the Mediterranean. They became silent witnesses to encounters of worlds, their bodies at once bridges and battlegrounds of cultural exchange. Their role, though scorned, tied them to the heart of history's great crossroads. When I recall the ports, I see them not only as places of ships and markets, but also as crucibles of contradiction. They thrived on order, yet tolerated disorder, sought purity, yet profited from indulgence. Prostitutes in these towns lived lives marked by movement, as restless as the waters that defined their cities. Their presence was as permanent as the harbour walls, and as essential to the life of the port as the ships themselves. Wherever armies gathered, the presence of prostitutes was never far behind. From mercenary bands roaming the German lands to royal campaigns in France, women followed the march, not only for coin, but for survival. They cooked meals, washed linen, and tended wounds, filling roles beyond what their trade suggested. Yet their sexual labor remained central, tolerated by commanders as a release valve for restless men. The life of a soldier's camp was harsh, and these women became part of its daily rhythm. I recall the dust of campaign roads, where long columns of men trudged under heavy armor. Alongside them trailed carts of provisions, smiths, and women who offered themselves in exchange for protection or payment. Their presence stirred disapproval from priests, yet commanders often recognized their utility. Without them, discipline threatened to collapse into assaults upon villages, a fate feared by both generals and townsfolk. Prostitution, in its harshest form, was framed as a necessary evil of war. The chronicles of the 100 Years' War mention women who lived in the shadows of armies, sometimes referred to as camp followers. They set up tents beside the soldiers, sharing in their hunger and cold. When battles raged, some even scavenged the fields afterward, searching for valuables to sell. Though they carried stigma, they also shared in the dangers of war, exposed to violence not only from enemies, but from the very men they served. Payment for their services was irregular, for soldiers themselves were often poorly supplied. At times, women were compensated with loot taken from towns or with scraps of food. This instability left them vulnerable, bound to men who could turn from client to abuser in an instant. Yet they endured, adapting to the shifting fortunes of the campaign. Their resilience mirrored that of the soldiers, though without recognition or honor. The church sought to purge armies of such women, declaring their presence a moral threat. Councils demanded their expulsion, citing scripture and the need for purity among warriors. Yet the cycle repeated. Expulsion, followed by quiet return. The men missed them. Commanders knew their absence bred disorder, and necessity overpowered decree. Sin was denounced in words, but reality wrote the harsher law of survival. Some women attached themselves to mercenary companies, infamous for their brutality. These bands, wandering without loyalty to king or crown, lived off plunder, and the women who followed them shared that life. They moved from town to town, enduring the same hunger, fear, and danger as the men. Their survival was bound to the sword, and in that world, there was no space for dignity, only endurance. The records of soldiers' lives often leave these women unnamed, yet traces survive. Court cases mention them, chroniclers scorn them, and townsfolk remembered their passing with resentment. They were blamed for disorder, yet their labour supported the very armies that shaped the fate of kingdoms. In the margins of parchment, their presence flickers like shadows cast by the campfire, overlooked but never absent. As I think on those battle-worn camps, I see how war did not distinguish between soldier and follower when hardship struck. Women shared in the march, the cold, and the hunger, yet bore additional scorn for the way they survived. Their story is inseparable from the story of soldiers themselves. To recall their lives is to remember that every army carried not only steel and banners, but also the silent endurance of those who walked beside them. Medieval sermons often spoke in symbols, and among them, the prostitute became a powerful image. She was cast as the fallen woman, a living embodiment of sin and weakness. Preachers used her figure to warn men of temptation and to instruct women in obedience. Her body, already burdened by survival, was turned into a lesson for the entire community. In her, society saw not a person, but a symbol, one that carried more weight than flesh should bear. Art echoed these messages. Illuminated manuscripts and church frescoes sometimes depicted women with flowing hair and lavish clothing, markers of lust and corruption. They stood beside demons or in contrast to virgins, reminders of the narrow path between salvation and damnation. The image of Mary Magdalene, often reimagined as a prostitute turned penitent, deepened this symbolism. She was both cautionary tale and promise of redemption, a duality pressed upon countless women who lived under that shadow. I recall hearing sermons where priests thundered that prostitutes dragged men into the abyss. They compared them to snares laid by Satan, tools of disorder in a world striving for Christian purity. Such words did not merely condemn the act, they carved fear into the minds of listeners. Women in the congregation were reminded of what awaited them should they step outside accepted roles. The prostitute became a warning, a figure of shame to secure obedience. Yet the paradox never disappeared. While condemned as fallen, prostitutes also embodied the possibility of grace. The story of Mary Magdalene was preached with fervor, showing how even the most sinful could be restored through repentance. This dual symbolism, damnation and redemption, made prostitutes both despised and strangely necessary within religious imagination. They allowed preachers to illustrate God's justice and mercy all at once. The imagery carried into literature, where prostitutes often appeared as characters of wit or deceit. In these portrayals, they symbolized not only lust, but also cunning, exposing the weaknesses of men. Their role was to highlight folly, their lives reduced to allegories for moral instruction. Though living women bore the consequences, their likeness in stories became a tool for shaping collective memory. Communities absorbed these lessons deeply. To see a prostitute in the street was to see not only a woman, but a walking sermon, a reminder of transgression. The clothing laws that marked them reinforced this perception, turning their very appearance into a symbol of dishonor. They could not escape it, for society demanded their existence as example, even while despising their reality. The fallen woman symbol thus served the needs of the powerful. It kept fear alive, reinforced boundaries, and justified exclusion. By reducing women to symbols, the church and society avoided facing the harsher truths of poverty, inequality, and the structures that forced them into such lives. It was easier to preach against lust than to reform the conditions that birthed desperation. As I reflect on this symbol, I see its cruelty. It stripped women of individuality, making them embodiments of sin rather than souls in need. The fallen woman was not only a figure in art and sermons, she was a living person forced to carry the weight of allegory. To remember her now is to peel away the symbol and see the humanity beneath, long overshadowed by centuries of judgment. The parchment of medieval courts, though written by clerks and judges, sometimes preserved the faint voices of women who otherwise would have vanished from memory. Prostitutes appeared in these records most often as defendants, accused of theft, disorder, or breaking civic laws. Yet within the testimonies, fragments of their own words survived. In those lines, I glimpsed their humanity, not as symbols of sin, but as women pleading for fairness in a world stacked against them. London's records speak of disputes over payment, where a prostitute would accuse a client of refusing to honour his bargain. These cases rarely ended in her favour, for the word of a dishonoured woman weighed little against that of a man. Still, her complaint was written down, echoing across centuries. It is a rare moment where we hear her directly, insisting upon her right to the coin promised, asserting dignity amid indignity. In Paris, court proceedings reveal darker struggles. Women spoke of violence at the hands of soldiers or students, describing beatings and assaults that left them without recourse. Judges sometimes fined the men, but more often the cases were dismissed, as though their suffering mattered less. Yet the very act of testimony shows courage. To speak one's truth before men who scorned them was an act of defiance, however futile the outcome. Nuremberg's records show another layer, where prostitutes were fined for working outside permitted quarters. Their pleas reveal how rules suffocated their survival. One declared she had sought clients in another part of town only because hunger pressed too hard. Such confessions were less about guilt than desperation, and though the court punished her, her words preserved the reality of lives cornered by law. Sometimes, these women appeared not as accused, but as witnesses. A prostitute might testify about thefts she had seen in taverns, or about disputes among her clients. In these rare moments, the court acknowledged her presence as part of the fabric of daily life. Yet even then, scribes often marked her with disdain, ensuring her testimony carried less weight than others. Her truth lived on parchment, but it walked with chains. I think often of the silence between these records. For every case written down, countless others were ignored, erased by indifference. The surviving voices are precious because they are so rare. They remind us that beneath the weight of sermons and laws, women still spoke, even when no one wished to listen. Their words cut through centuries, carrying sorrow, resilience, and the need to be heard. What strikes me most is the ordinariness of their concerns. They spoke not of great battles or kings, but of unpaid debts, stolen garments, broken promises. These were the struggles of daily existence, laid bare in legal disputes. Their voices remind us that history is not only the tale of rulers and saints, but of women who demanded payment for bread, or justice for blows received. Their truths were humble, yet profound. As I sit by the fire tonight, I think of those women whose words survived in ink. They did not seek to become symbols. They sought fairness in the smallest matters of life. Though courts often denied them, their voices reach us still. They speak across the centuries, asking not for pity, but for recognition. In their testimonies, we hear the unvarnished echo of medieval life, raw and enduring. In the tangled web of medieval prejudice, Jewish communities carried burdens heavier than most. Accusations clung to them in every century, charges of usury, of poisoning wells, and of corrupting Christian souls. Among these falsehoods was the claim that Jewish women engaged in prostitution, an image spread more by hostility than by truth. Such slanders deepened their marginalization, painting them as threats to morality while denying them protection under law. Prejudice served as both weapon and justification. I remember reading records from German towns where Jewish women were singled out in brothel ordinances, as though their presence carried unique danger. The accusations were not always supported by evidence, but they reflected the anxieties of Christian neighbors. By associating Jews with prostitution, society reinforced its image of them as outsiders, untrustworthy and corrupt. These charges did not only stain reputations, they exposed communities to violence and exclusion. Jewish men, too, were not spared from suspicion. Chronicles accused them of frequenting brothels, casting them as hypocrites who defied both their own faith and Christian law. These claims often appeared in moments of rising tension, used to inflame anger against Jewish settlements. The truth mattered little. The accusations served their purpose as tools of scapegoating. In times of crisis, it was easier to condemn a minority already despised than to confront deeper causes. The irony was bitter. In many regions, Jews were restricted from joining guilds, barred from landholding, and confined to trades deemed dishonorable by Christians. Some turned to money lending, others to marginal commerce. For women, choices were even fewer. To accuse them of prostitution was to condemn them for roles forced upon them by exclusion itself. Poverty and discrimination created the conditions, and then prejudice turned those conditions into accusations. Court documents occasionally record cases of Jewish women fined for sexual misconduct, though the penalties were often harsher than those faced by Christians. These moments reveal the double weight they bore: the stigma of their trade and the stigma of their faith. A Christian prostitute might be scorned, but a Jewish prostitute was framed as proof of an entire people's corruption. Individual choices became collective blame, a cruelty sharpened by hatred. In Iberian kingdoms, where Jewish communities were larger, accusations took on a broader form. Preachers linked prostitution to the supposed immorality of Jews as a whole, weaving it into sermons that justified segregation and persecution. Such words were not idle. They paved the road toward expulsions and violence. The prostitute, already burdened by shame, became another weapon against her people. Her life turned into a symbol of collective guilt. Despite this hostility, some records show that Jewish women, like others, sought redemption through conversion. A prostitute who embraced Christianity might be praised for leaving both sin and Judaism behind, her body and faith recast as cleansed. Yet this salvation often served less her own soul than the church's triumph. She became an example in sermons, proof of Christian superiority. Her personal struggle was swallowed by a broader narrative of domination. Reflecting on these patterns, I see how prejudice twisted lives into tools of condemnation. Prostitutes already bore the scorn of society. Jewish prostitutes bore it doubly, as women and as members of a despised faith. Their story is not only one of survival, but of enduring the sharpest edges of medieval fear and hatred. To remember them is to uncover a layer of history often hidden, where stigma was sharpened into weaponry, and humanity was obscured by prejudice. Behind the walls of brothels and taverns, the trade of prostitution was rarely left in the hands of the women alone. Pimps and procurers prowled the streets, exploiting desperation for their own profit. Laws condemned them, yet their presence was constant, for they supplied and controlled the very women authorities claimed to regulate. Madams, by contrast, often stood at the center of brothel life, organizing the business and keeping order, sometimes even under municipal oversight. Their roles, though different, reveal the shadow economy that surrounded prostitution. In Avignon, records speak of brothels run by women who had once been prostitutes themselves. These madams managed houses with strict rules, setting prices, enforcing curfews, and arranging payments to civic officials. Their authority gave them a measure of protection, yet they remained stigmatized. Respectable society still saw them as corrupt, even as it depended on their organization to contain vice. Power and dishonor walked hand in hand. Pimps, on the other hand, drew harsher condemnation. In many towns, procuring was treated as a crime more serious than prostitution itself. Men who lured women into the trade or lived off their earnings were fined, flogged, or exiled. Yet despite the severity of the law, they thrived in the shadows. Their networks extended through markets and taverns, promising protection or opportunity, while in truth, tightening chains of exploitation. I recall a case from Nuremberg where a man was accused of recruiting young women from nearby villages and forcing them into brothels. The court punished him, but others quickly replaced him, for demand never ceased. The pattern revealed a truth. As long as prostitution endured, so too would those who profited from its organization. Law struck at individuals, but could not uproot the structure itself. Madams occupied a more ambiguous space. Some were respected within their trade, providing shelter and food for the women they employed. Others were accused of cruelty, keeping most of the profit and binding women to debt. The brothel became both refuge and prison, a place where survival was ensured, but freedom was scarce. The madam's power lay in her ability to navigate between civic authorities, clients, and the women under her roof. Prostitutes themselves sometimes sought out such arrangements willingly, preferring the relative safety of a brothel to the dangers of solitary work. In regulated houses, violence was less frequent, and authorities intervened more readily. Yet this protection came at the cost of autonomy. The madam decided who worked, when, and for how much, her word carrying more weight than that of the women she oversaw. It was survival, but not freedom. The church condemned both pimps and madams, seeing them as corrupters of souls. Preachers likened them to demons feeding upon human weakness, multiplying sin for profit. Civic authorities, while equally harsh in words, often tolerated madams for the stability they brought. Brothels kept prostitution contained, and municipal coffers filled with their taxes. Once again, morality bent before the needs of governance. Looking back, I see in pimps and madams the embodiment of exploitation layered upon exploitation. Prostitutes bore the weight of stigma and poverty, while those who controlled the trade profited from their struggle. Some madams, themselves survivors of the same path, turned necessity into power. Others wielded cruelty. Together, they remind us how deeply prostitution was entangled in systems of control, where even the margins of society had hierarchies of their own. When festivals filled the streets, the order of medieval life loosened its grip. Carnival, with its masks, music, and mockery of authority, turned towns into stages where roles could be reversed. In these moments of release, prostitutes stepped into visibility with fewer restraints. They mingled openly with crowds, their trade woven into the spirit of revelry. For a brief span, scorn softened, replaced by laughter, song, and indulgence that blurred the boundaries of propriety. I remember Florence, where carnival brought parades of colour and noise. Men in masks hid their faces, and women of the trade seized the chance to approach them more boldly, free from the daily weight of stigma. Transactions that were usually hidden in alleyways spilled into public squares, cloaked by festivity. The authorities, who on ordinary days enforced laws strictly, looked the other way, knowing the energy of the crowd could not be contained. In Cologne, chroniclers wrote of prostitutes dressing in extravagant costumes during festival days. Their garments, forbidden in normal times, became part of the masquerade, turning dishonor into spectacle. The symbolism was sharp. The very clothes that marked them as outcasts were, during carnival, transformed into ornaments of celebration. Yet when the festival ended, the stripes and veils returned to being badges of shame. Freedom was fleeting, a mask worn for a night. These gatherings drew men from all walks of life, students, soldiers, merchants, even clerics, who moved more freely under the cover of disguise. Prostitutes thrived in this mingling, their services in greater demand than ever. The streets rang with laughter, but beneath it lay the familiar reality. For the women, Profit mattered more than festivity. Carnival filled their purses, yet it did not erase their marginality once the drums fell silent. Satirical plays performed during festivals often mocked priests, lords, and even the women of the trade themselves. Prostitutes became characters in farces, symbols of vice and wit, used to ridicule hypocrisy. In these portrayals, they were both insulted and celebrated, mirrors held up to society's contradictions. The laughter of the crowd carried cruelty and amusement in equal measure. It was a reminder that the festival mocked everyone, but never spared the vulnerable. The church viewed these celebrations with suspicion, condemning their excess as doorways to sin. Yet even bishops struggled to suppress them, for carnival was tied deeply to the rhythms of life, a release before Lent's austerity. Prostitutes embodied the very danger preachers warned against, yet they were also proof of how little control sermons held over human appetite. During these days, the pulpit's authority was drowned out by drums and revelry. After the festivals ended, the same authorities who had turned blind eyes returned to enforcing rules. Women were once again confined to their districts, marked by clothing laws, and fined for transgressions. The transition was harsh, as though the brief liberty of carnival had been nothing more than a tolerated illusion. Their lives returned to their usual place on the margins, carrying with them the memory of nights when they had walked more freely. Festivals reveal how fragile the boundaries of morality truly were. In ordinary days, prostitutes were scorned, controlled, and silenced. But in times of collective release, society welcomed their presence, even celebrated it. Their story within carnival is one of paradox, accepted when vice was dressed as laughter, rejected when order returned. It shows us that morality in the Middle Ages was not fixed, but shifted with the rhythms of feast and fast. Life at the margins carried constant peril, and for prostitutes, violence was an ever-present companion. Clients could turn from friendly to brutal in moments, emboldened by drink or by the knowledge that the law favored them. Many women suffered beatings, assaults, or theft, with little hope of justice. Their cries rarely carried weight in the courts, for their dishonor stripped them of credibility. Violence was not the exception, but the daily risk of their survival. In towns where soldiers gathered, the danger grew sharper. Men hardened by battle sought release with little restraint, and prostitutes bore the brunt of their frustrations. Some commanders tried to protect women working near military quarters, but enforcement was rare. Chronicles mention skirmishes in which prostitutes were left injured or dead, their stories recorded only as footnotes to the deeds of men. In truth, their blood stained the same streets as knights and merchants. Taverns, often centers of their work, were both opportunity and threat. A woman could find clients within their walls, but she could also find fists and knives turned against her. Disputes over payment frequently ended in blows. Court records show cases where women accused men of assault, yet judgments seldom favored them. The tavern, full of ale and tempers, was a place where violence and commerce intertwined without mercy. The law recognized the dangers, but only in part. Some towns issued rules forbidding men from harming prostitutes, yet such laws were rarely enforced. In reality, the women themselves were often fined or punished if fights broke out, as though they had provoked the violence. Blame fell easily upon those already marked by dishonor. Protection existed more in words than in practice, leaving women exposed. The church's role did little to soften this reality. Preachers scorned prostitutes as agents of sin, and when they suffered violence, it was often seen as deserved punishment. Their pain became a moral lesson rather than an injustice to be righted. Mercy was scarce, for society judged their profession as the cause of their suffering. In such a world, their wounds were carried silently, hidden behind veils of shame. Despite this, women found ways to endure. Some formed informal networks of mutual support, warning one another of dangerous men or pooling resources for safety. Others sought the relative shelter of brothels, where madams offered a measure of protection, though often at the cost of freedom. Survival depended on navigating threats as much as earning coin. To live in that trade was to carry scars both visible and hidden. I recall hearing of women who armed themselves with small knives tucked into belts or sleeves, a desperate shield against brutality. Their defiance rarely found mention in chronicles, but it speaks of courage. They did not wait for justice that never came. They forged what little protection they could. These quiet acts of resistance reveal strength often overlooked, a will to survive in a world that gave them no safe place. Violence shaped their existence as much as poverty or stigma. Every alley, tavern, and marketplace held both promise and danger. Their history is not only one of condemnation, but of constant struggle against harm. Remembering them requires more than acknowledging their trade. It requires seeing the risks they faced daily and the resilience they carried in enduring a life balanced precariously between survival and violence. The tavern was the beating heart of many medieval towns, filled with the sound of laughter, quarrels, and the clinking of mugs. Wine and ale loosened tongues, softening the weight of daily toil. Within these noisy halls, prostitutes found steady work, for drink and desire often walked together. Men came seeking warmth beyond the fire, and women offered company in exchange for coin. Taverns became places where survival and indulgence met under the same smoky rafters. I recall taverns in Paris where prostitutes mingled freely with patrons, moving among the benches with practiced ease. Negotiations took place in whispers, masked by song and chatter. Owners often welcomed their presence, for they drew more customers, ensuring barrels emptied and profits grew. Yet the same owners sometimes denounced them when trouble followed, shifting blame onto women who had been invited in the first place. Such hypocrisy was as common as the drink itself. Wine played its own role in shaping encounters. Intoxication lowered restraint, turning conversations into proposals and, at times, into violence. Prostitutes were both beneficiaries and victims of this pattern, earning more when men drank deeply, yet suffering greater risks when reason faltered. The tavern's warmth could turn cold quickly, and the promise of laughter could collapse into blows or theft. Their work thrived in the glow of candles, but danger lingered in the shadows. Authorities watched taverns with suspicion, for they bred disorder as much as commerce. Regulations often forbade prostitutes from entering certain establishments, yet such rules were ignored when profits beckoned. The law tried to separate indulgence from sin, but the two were entangled too tightly. Taverns stood as crossroads of trade, vice, and fellowship, impossible to police fully. Within those walls, morality bent beneath the weight of human appetite. Taverns also blurred the line between hospitality and brothel. Some kept private rooms where clients and prostitutes could withdraw, away from the common hall. Others served as meeting places, where arrangements were made before moving elsewhere. In both cases, drink provided the gateway, easing negotiations and dulling the sense of shame. The cup of wine became as much a tool of the trade as the coin itself. Chroniclers mention taverns in university towns, where students gathered and prostitutes were a constant presence. In Oxford, disputes spilled into the streets, drawing the attention of officials. In Paris, authorities alternated between bans and fines, knowing full well that neither kept women from taverns for long. The establishments were too central to social life to ever be separated from the trade. Where men gathered to drink, women followed, and so the cycle endured. The church condemned taverns as dens of sin, warning that drink led to fornication as surely as fire led to smoke. Priests urged their flocks to avoid them, yet many clerics themselves were known to frequent such halls. Once again, the words of morality clashed with the realities of daily life. Taverns could not be erased, and within them, prostitution remained a fixture, as unmovable as the barrels of wine stacked against the wall. As I reflect on those nights of laughter and quarrel, I see the tavern as both refuge and snare. For prostitutes, it was a place of livelihood, filled with opportunity, but also danger. Their footsteps echoed among spilled wine and broken promises, their lives bound to the same rhythms that filled cups and emptied purses. To walk into a tavern was to step into a world where survival hung in the balance, carried on the taste of ale and the weight of coin. By the late Middle Ages, fear of unseen powers crept through every town and village. Accusations of witchcraft spread like sparks in dry fields, igniting suspicion against women already standing on the margins. Prostitutes, long burdened by dishonor, were easy targets. Their knowledge of herbs, potions, and charms, sometimes used for love or fertility, was reinterpreted as proof of sorcery. What once seemed simple remedies became evidence of dark pacts in the eyes of a fearful society. I recall cases in Germany where prostitutes were accused of enchanting clients, luring them into ruin with more than beauty. Men claimed they had been bewitched into spending coin or forsaking their families. Courts listened, and the women's reputations as sinners made the accusations believable. To be poor and dishonored was already dangerous. To be marked as a witch was to stand at the edge of a fire no plea could quench. In France, whispers told of prostitutes selling charms or powders, said to secure a lover's affection. Such practices were not unusual, for folk remedies and magic mingled in daily life. Yet when tensions rose, plague, famine, or war, these small acts became grounds for charges of witchcraft. The woman who sold comfort one day might face denunciation the next. The line between healer, charmer, and witch blurred fatally. The church's voice thundered against both lust and sorcery, linking the two as threats to the Christian soul. Preachers declared prostitutes to be agents of the devil, their trade seen as a gateway to darker powers. Confessions were often wrung from women under duress, words spoken not in truth but in fear. The more society demanded proof of evil, the more it found it in the bodies of the vulnerable. Not all accusations led to execution, but even suspicion was ruin enough. A woman labeled as witch could lose her clients, her shelter, and her life within a community. Exile was common, forcing her onto the roads where survival grew even harsher. Those who escaped fire or gallows still bore scars of shame, their names whispered in fear long after the trial ended. I remember reading of Italy, where some prostitutes were accused of casting the evil eye upon men who spurned them. Such charges reflected less the reality of sorcery than the anxieties of men ashamed of their own desires. By turning blame into accusation, they transformed personal weakness into public danger. The prostitute, once again, bore the cost of sins that were not hers alone. Witchcraft trials grew more frequent as the centuries closed, and prostitutes were often swept into them alongside midwives and widows. Their visibility in taverns and brothels made them easy to accuse, but they were already marked as fallen. In the frenzy of fear, no distinction was made between trade, superstition, and heresy. Women who had lived in the shadows of society now faced flames in its center. When I reflect on those accusations, I see not witches, but scapegoats. Prostitutes carried the burden of desire, poverty, and now fear of sorcery, their lives pressed under every weight society could place upon them. The witchcraft trials remind us how quickly fear can twist into persecution, and how the most vulnerable are always the first to burn. Their memory is a solemn warning carved into the silence of history. As the 15th century waned, the uneasy balance that had long marked prostitution began to falter. Towns that once taxed and regulated brothels grew less willing to tolerate them. Fear of disease, especially the spread of syphilis, sharpened moral anxiety. Religious reformers called for purity with renewed fervor, and authorities, pressured by both health and faith, began closing the doors that had once been left ajar. The slow decline of tolerance was not sudden, but it reshaped the lives of countless women. In German cities such as Nuremberg and Augsburg, civic councils that had previously managed municipal brothels reversed course. Official houses were shut down, and women who had once worked under regulation were forced into hiding. The shift was justified as a matter of both morality and safety. Yet in practice, it drove prostitution into more dangerous spaces where oversight disappeared and risks multiplied. Suppression brought not eradication, but greater peril. England followed a similar path. The Southwark brothels, long under the bishop's authority, faced increasing restrictions. By the end of the 15th century, voices of reform denounced their existence as intolerable. When syphilis struck, authorities moved decisively, linking the disease to brothels and closing them. The same institutions that had profited from the trade now turned against it, leaving women without the thin protection that regulation once provided. In France, too, the mood hardened. Parisian authorities shut down many houses, and prostitutes faced stricter penalties if caught. What had once been tolerated as a necessary evil was now framed as a corruption to be purged. This new severity reflected the rising influence of reformist preachers who urged cities to cleanse themselves of vice. Their words found fertile ground in a society shaken by plague, war, and uncertainty. The Iberian kingdoms tied morality more closely to the crown. Kings who had once managed brothels as sources of revenue began to distance themselves, eager to project piety in an age of consolidation. Royal edicts restricted or outlawed prostitution in certain regions, though enforcement varied. Still, the message was clear. What had once been tolerated as part of civic life was no longer acceptable in the same form. The world was changing, and women felt the change most acutely. This decline did not mean prostitution vanished. Rather, it slipped into hidden corners, less visible, but more precarious. Without regulated houses, women worked in alleys, inns, and private dwellings, far more vulnerable to exploitation and violence. The safety, however limited, that came from municipal oversight was lost. The repression meant that prostitution became less controlled, and women bore heavier risks without losing the burden of stigma. The Reformation intensified this shift. Reformers like Martin Luther denounced prostitution, demanding the eradication of brothels altogether. Their voices added momentum to a trend already underway, reshaping the moral landscape of Europe. The late medieval world, once marked by compromise, hardened into an age of stricter judgment. Prostitution became less a tolerated necessity and more a sin to be uprooted, at least in official decree. Looking back, I see this decline of tolerance as a narrowing of choices. Women who once had a place, however dishonored, within the framework of towns, now found themselves cast into greater danger. The balance between condemnation and pragmatism shifted toward condemnation alone. The memory of that change reveals how fragile tolerance can be, and how swiftly fear and reform can close doors once left ajar. The women endured, but their world grew darker. When I wandered from one kingdom to another, I saw how attitudes toward prostitution shifted with borders. In Italy, cities such as Venice and Florence treated it as part of civic life, weaving brothels into the governance of the commune. Regulation and taxation framed the trade not as moral decay, but as an inevitable necessity to be managed. By contrast, Northern Europe often leaned towards stricter bans, driven by sterner religious sentiment. Geography shaped not only economies, but also morality. In Venice, prostitution was tied directly to state policy. Brothels were licensed, and their profits helped fund civic works. The city accepted what others condemned, seeing management as better than chaos. Women in these houses lived under rules, restricted yet shielded by the law's recognition. The Venetian approach reflected its mercantile spirit, practical, profit-driven, and indifferent to lofty ideals that ignored human need. It was not mercy, but it offered a form of stability. Florence revealed a similar paradox. Municipal brothels were seen as essential for preserving social order, yet prostitutes themselves were stigmatized and marked with distinctive dress. The city spoke with two voices, one that relied on their presence, and another that declared their dishonor. Italian pragmatism accepted the contradiction, folding it into the rhythm of civic life. To live there as a prostitute was to be both tolerated and shamed, embraced and excluded. England showed another face. In London, the Southwark brothels were under ecclesiastical authority, their existence tied to the very institution that condemned fornication. The bishops' coffers filled with their profits, even as priests denounced sin from the pulpit. Such hypocrisy left its mark on history, for it revealed the uneasy alliance between faith and revenue. Yet by the end of the 15th century, that tolerance withered, replaced by closures driven by fear of disease. In France, the picture was fractured. Parisian authorities tolerated brothels for centuries, yet provincial towns often imposed harsher restrictions. Local councils carried the weight of decision, and their choices reflected the mood of each community. Where commerce thrived, prostitution was contained and taxed. Where morality held sway, it was suppressed more harshly. France mirrored Europe as a whole, divided, inconsistent, caught between necessity and condemnation. The Iberian kingdoms tied prostitution closely to royal authority. Brothels were sometimes managed by the crown, their revenue woven into royal finances. Yet the rising tide of religious fervor, intensified by the Reconquista and the looming Inquisition, pushed toward greater restriction. Prostitution became entangled not only in questions of morality, but also in the politics of faith and empire. The monarchy wielded its presence and absence as a tool of control. Scandinavia, distant from the bustle of Mediterranean trade, showed less formal organization. Prostitution there was often hidden, punished under broad charges of fornication or disorder. Without municipal brothels, women navigated their survival in smaller, less regulated exchanges. Though less documented, the reality was no less present. Even in lands of sparse population and harsher climate, the same patterns of poverty and stigma shaped their lives. What these comparisons reveal is not a single story, but a mosaic. Across Europe, prostitution was at once condemned and tolerated, hidden and managed, punished and profited from. Each region crafted its own balance, shaped by trade, faith, and necessity. Yet everywhere, the women bore the same burdens of dishonor and vulnerability. Their lives, though lived under different laws, carried a shared thread of endurance through contradiction. When I reflect upon the centuries gone, I see that prostitution in the Middle Ages left behind more than scandal or shame. It left the imprint of contradiction. These women were condemned in sermons yet tolerated by law, hidden in alleys yet present in records, scorned as fallen yet relied upon by soldiers, students, and merchants. Their existence revealed the gap between ideals and reality, a mirror that showed society's struggles with faith, power, and need. Memory does not erase them, it preserves their paradox. The legacy lies in the silence as much as in the words. Chroniclers rarely wrote their names, yet their presence haunts every corner of medieval life, in brothel ordinances, in court records, in the sermons of priests, and in the satire of poets. They were never honored, but they were never absent. History carried them like shadows cast across the parchment, faint but undeniable. Their lives remind us that silence in records is not absence, but deliberate forgetting. Over time, the figure of the prostitute became layered with symbolism. She stood as a warning of sin, as a scapegoat for disease, as a vessel for redemption. Yet beneath these symbols were women of flesh and hunger, women whose choices were not made in freedom, but in necessity. Historical memory, shaped by those who judged them, turned their existence into allegory. Our task is to look past the allegory and see the human truth. The contradictions of tolerance and condemnation left marks that extend beyond the Middle Ages. Later centuries inherited these patterns, wrestling with the same questions of morality, control, and survival. Brothels might close, laws might change, but the stigma endured. passed down like a wound unhealed. Their legacy is not confined to history books. It lingers in the ways society continues to judge and marginalize women on the edges. What strikes me most is the resilience that shines through even the harshest records. Despite violence, disease, and scorn, prostitutes endured, carving survival where none was meant for them. They navigated laws designed to control them, bore clothing meant to shame them, and still lived, still spoke, still left traces in the margins of history. Their memory is not only one of condemnation, but of endurance against overwhelming odds. To remember them is to confront the hypocrisy of the age. The same society that built cathedrals of breathtaking beauty relied upon their presence in shadows. Kings and bishops condemned them in public, yet profited from their taxes or sought their company in secret. Their story forces us to see the Middle Ages not as a world of pure devotion or discipline, but as a world of human frailty wrapped in grandeur. Their legacy also lies in the lessons they leave us. To study their lives is to ask how societies treat those pushed to the margins, how morality bends when confronted with necessity, and how power uses stigma to maintain control. They remind us that history is not only the tale of rulers and saints, but of women who bore dishonor yet carried entire economies in silence. Their truth sharpens our understanding of the past. As I sit here with the fire crackling low, I know their memory must not be lost. They were more than symbols, more than warnings. They were human beings who lived, suffered, and endured. To honor their history is not to romanticize their struggle, but to acknowledge it with clarity. Their legacy is woven into the fabric of medieval Europe, a reminder that dignity can be denied by law and sermon, but it endures in memory, waiting to be seen.